Good morning. Welcome back to the homestead. I'm recording this on May the 10th, hence the reason I don't have the branches cleaned up here yet. Most of the wind you hear is the wind up in the trees now. The first thing we're going to do is fell this tree. Talk about the safety issues and the whys and hows of felling a tree and cutting it up. When coming to a tree that you think you want to get, how straight is that trunk? So this is one way. It's pretty much perfectly vertical that way. There's a slight little lean towards the west that way. Not much though. Now because this was all forced that I cut down the trees, you see how most of the branches are over on that side? So that would actually put more weight on that side of the tree and give it the same effect as if it had a slight lean that side. However, if I wanted to fall it in the way that those branches are putting the weight on it, it would go right over into those trees over there and get hung up in those trees. You see this spruce here, I had an opening that way, and the birch, there were another two birch there. When I cut down the tree, I didn't get it to fall straight out the opening. It caught in this birch right here. I couldn't very well stand on this side of that clump of birch because this large spruce tree now was hanging out over. And so if I cut off the birch on this side, the spruce tree will come right down on top of me. So I had to go around. I cut my first little wedge, but then I had to hide in behind these other two trees. Ended up having to go around this way, stick the chainsaw in through there, and upside down, like the top of the bar I was using to cut through. So a very awkward position to get that birch down, and then it caught up into this one. So I had to do the same thing here. I had to make my notch and then cut with the top of the bar to get that one to come down, to get that spruce tree down. Now that's the safety issues of how you're going to fall it. There is no power lines here, so I don't have to worry about it, but you can imagine now looking up to see, could that tree fall into a power line? And if it falls into a power line, you've got trouble. If it's an electrical line, of course, electrocution, you could tear down power lines, you could tear down phone lines, etc. I don't have to worry about that here. Because I've got this opening spot here, I want the tree to fall that way. Now I have to do one last thing before I can just cut this tree off to avoid another safety issue. I need to make what they call a back cut. So I cut the tree across here with the bar pointing perpendicular to the way I want the tree to fall. Then I go up so far and cut down on an angle, once again with the bar pointing perpendicular. Then I have a wedge cut out here, and when I cut in through this and I have this little piece of tree left that acts as an hinge to tip it the way I want it to go, plus it won't break up the tree. It's possible that if you just cut through, that it can get so far through and then a crack would propagate up the tree like this. Now this is also something you don't do, cut the tree right off at the base at the beginning. I'll tell you why in a minute. But you see, I cut this tree down. I did make a initial back cut, but when I cut this side, I cut it a little too far up. Plus, I didn't do a V, so the tree couldn't tip. And when it started to fall, a crack propagated way on up. So now, as this tree fell, instead of just falling out that way, its fulcrum point was here, and this old piece swung up like this. So now I've got a tree standing here. Now it didn't break off, but you can imagine if I were here cutting down this tree and a crack propagated up here, and then it hit here, it completely broke off, the tree hits the ground up here. Now I have this big log sitting up at face height, and where's it going to go? Right, it could come flying right at me. So that's why you do that back cut. And do it as a V, not as just a straight in cut. The last thing I do, I don't think everybody does this, but I've got a 16-inch bar, so, and this is pretty wide right down at ground level. Where can I get this comfortably cut off with the final cut? Which is about right there. And I'll go up about 1 junk's worth. So that's about right here. I'll cut the tree off right there. Now, another thing I'm going to do, I'm not all the way through, am I? So this is something you got to look at. You see, space, but my chain bar is in this far. So I have to come out and make sure I've got it equal all the way through. That's good enough. I've got to cut back this far now. The reason being, I'm going to put this wedge in there. You can put in just a piece of wood or whatever. But if this tree should lean back, then it'll jam my chainsaw. I've had that happen several times. So I'm going to put this wedge in there that I've got that in far enough, and then continue to cut the tree down. Looks like it's going to fall the way I wanted it to anyway. It just moved. But now I can't tip back and jam my chain. Now, you see, just as I expected, those leaves, those limbs up there, is preventing it from falling that way. Now the wind is helping me. Oh, so I can't show you the rest of the way. It didn't have much weight leaning it back, and that gust of wind just helped me blow it over. But I did take the wedges just in case I needed to, and I was going to drive them in and give them just that little bit of extra push it needed. And this tree didn't have much longer to live. I said in my forest walkthrough that it didn't look very healthy because of those big cracks in the bark. And just look at that. The entire centre gone soft, and just a little bit of live wood ring out on the outside. I had hoped that because it was so big that I would be able to do something else with this portion, that it would be solid all the way through, but it's going to be no good for anything but firewood now. But you see the hinge that I was talking about? So this now acted as an hinge to follow it exactly that way. And because it was more in the center of the tree, the crack couldn't propagate up the tree. Quite often, when I'm going and cutting up a tree, you see these bigger branches, I'll cut them up as I'm going because they're standing up and I'm there with the chainsaw. I might as well cut them up into junk lengths. And once again, I find that most people just take the trunk of the tree, but there's quite a bit of firewood in those branches. So when you're cutting up a tree, think about that. I mean, when you want some small wood to put in when you're starting a fire or something, that's a fairly big piece of wood. And they're all up the tree like that. So I'm going to go along now and take down this, cut this up. But before I do, I want to point out one last thing. The reason I go up one chunk up and then cut it off. Okay, remember I said if the crack propagated up, you would have your fulcrum point up here then, and your tree would swing out and could come back at you. When the tree falls down, if there's something out there, this side of its center of gravity, then the same thing can happen. As it comes down, it hits that whatever it is out there, and then this end of the tree pops up and you get a similar danger. It's not as dangerous, but it could be depending on the size of the tree. However, if you cut it a little off the ground and then cut this junk off afterwards, you see it fell out, and they'll all do that. Instead of falling right down beside the stump, the tree will go out that way. So even if it hit something out there, I was standing here, it would swing back beside me because it will be out away from the stump. Now that's some big wood. I'm going to have to split that. It's not so easy to tell here. You see, I have some knots here. Then there's a space where there's none. Knots here, space where there's none. More knots. So come up here a little ways. And it's much more evident. So we have this situation. I don't know if there's any hardwoods that does this, but spruce and fir does this. When the trees get older, they're getting big like this, you'll notice you have your ring of branches, which translates into knots in your final chunk of wood. A space where there's no branches or very small ones, and then another ring of big branches, another space, and another ring. The thing that makes splitting these up the hardest is knots in the chunk of wood. So you got to think about that before you actually start to cut the thing up. And how you're going to go about doing that really depends on how long this space is and how long of a chunk of wood your wood stove can take. You could cut just below the ring there and then cut just below the ring here. And then you'd have a chunk of wood with all the knots down in the one end, and you start splitting from up here. They would still create an issue sometimes when you're splitting, but it would be much easier than if the knots were in the middle of the chunk. The other thing you can do is cut a short piece out and then cut this piece out of the center. And you got a short piece with knots in it, a regular chunk of wood with no knots, and then another short piece with knots in it. The other thing is, like I said, well, personal preference, right? Whichever way you want to do it. When you're stacking it up, you take this one and put on the pile, then you take two of those and put there to make up the space of one chunk of wood. Now for mine, I try to cut my chunks of wood the length of my chain on the bar on my chainsaw. So I'll turn it around so you can see this better. You can see that bar fits in between the two spaces. So I'll cut a short one, cut out the center, and cut another short one. Before I go any further, you see all the small wood I cut off from the branches? There's a couple loads of there's a couple of wheelbarrow loads of firewood there, and just what I cut up from the branches. There will be some that I'll take more yet when I come up with my pruning saw and start cleaning up these branches that I don't have cut up yet. I've gotten to the point where the tree was laying on that stump there, so I put a chunk of wood under here, and I could later on put another chunk of wood where it's off the ground there. Because I'm used to cutting the wood down there now, and because there's a lot of debris holding it up off the soil, I could cut this up when it's right down on the ground, but it's just easier if it is up a little bit off the ground. It's all cut up, and if I'm lucky, I got enough gas left in the chainsaw to cut the stump off of that. No, didn't make it. Got to be 3/4 of the way through. So that's what I can do with my chainsaw. If I can find somebody who has a chainsaw with a really long bar on it, I think I know somebody, then I cut that base down as well. Hopefully get it right down to the ground. Sometimes you can't avoid it. See, I've got a couple of knots in this one, but it's just the two. These are small branches I was talking about, so it should still be able to split it down there and then down this side where there's no knots. Now I take this one. You see, it's short enough now. I really only have to split this in half, and then I can fit it in my stove. Whereas this one, I'm going to have to at least split it into quarters. I might even split it into 6 pieces. I came back up and cut the other chunk off of the stump. I had to bring some notes with me. I took some pictures, filled up the truck. It was about 1/3 of a cord for this tree. The house I'm currently living in, it takes about 6 cords of firewood per year to keep warm. So 1/3 of a cord, that's 3 trees in a cord, or 18 trees per year. I took a picture of the stump so that I could put it in my computer and easily count the rings. I counted 60 rings, and at this height, so I'm saying about 65 years old. So in 65 years, I would have used 1,260 trees about this size. I did some research of the university reports. Their suggestion for making a spruce plantation would be to space your trees at about 8 feet, and the trees would live to be about 80 years old. At 8 feet spacing, it would be 1,736 seedlings per hectare, which is 703 seedlings per acre. So the 1,260 trees that I would need over 65-70 years would cover about 1.8 acres. Now, of course, I'm not going to be doing just spruce trees, but this area back to where the black spruce starts is all good area for white spruce. So I could be sustainable in the sense that it could go on forever in growing white spruce for firewood to heat my out. Now I'm going to be, of course, having a polyculture, what Mother Nature gives me, which is white spruce, fir, birch, cherry, red pine, white pine, the trembling aspen. They're no good for firewood, but they will be hanging around. Maple. So I'm thinking of right now, that's 8 species, and I will try to see how many other species of multiple use species is what I'm going to be planting. So the mulberries look like they're coming in well. Apple, cherry plum. I'm hoping the locusts do well, so that's honey locust and black locust. That's 5 that I've got that might do alright. So that's my polyculture over about 2 acres, and then I'll have the understory, because when you're actually maintaining a forest garden, you trim the lower branches off your trees, so that 8-foot spacing or 10-foot spacing I've been doing with my plantings will give you a lot of area underneath for shade-loving plants. Vines, blueberries, ramps, and several others, mushrooms especially. So I am getting quite pleased with my forest now. It took me a little while to settle that it could be done, but yeah, it's getting exciting and I'm happy. Hope you enjoyed the video, and make sure you're subscribed, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.